Hello, everyone. I'm Olympia. Thank you for being here with me in this wonderful place called Lights Out Library, and I have a great story to tell you. Tonight, I will tell you about the Ninth Legion of the Roman Empire. It was almost an entire army with thousands of men that surprisingly vanished from records in the 2nd century, never to be written about again as far as we know. This is mysterious because the Romans left many archives, inscriptions, and archaeological remains, which serve as historical records that allow us to track their history. We will explore what the Legion was, how they operated, and what may have happened to the Ninth Legion. But first, allow me to take a few seconds of your time to let you know that we have a Patreon page for those of you who wish to and can support this project. Get more of it and listen ad-free on your favorite podcast app. Patreon is a platform that allows you to contribute directly to our work financially. Our least expensive tier is $3 per month, but it doesn't mean you will get less. We let people contribute what they can or wish to, and everyone gets everything that is on our page, because the world is a better place when the sun shines for everyone. If you join, you will gain access to various new features. For example, you will have the option to listen to all episodes, with or without background sounds. You will have the capability to download all these audios, to listen offline, and participate in selecting future topics. We also offer advanced releases and updates on upcoming episodes. There are many stories available only to our Patreons. You will find a link in the description box and the first comment pinned under the video, as well as links to different streaming options like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music, which may be better suited for you. If you fall asleep and wish to resume the video later, or jump directly to a particular part of the story, timestamps are also listed in the description and pinned in the first comment. But before we begin, if you wish to, you may close your eyes and allow yourself to forget about any worries as we embark on this adventure together. Now assume a comfortable position, maybe move a bit to settle. Take a long, deep, relaxing breath, and when you slowly exhale, feel your shoulders drop. Release the tension in your neck. Let your face soften and your jaw relax too. Make sure your fingers are not clenched and that your legs are relaxed too. And allow the sound of my voice to guide you through this journey. And now it's time to explore. So why is the Ninth Legion at the center of a historical mystery? It disappeared, but so did all Roman legions eventually. This is not extraordinary by itself. What distinguishes this case is that the legion seems to have vanished from records, and this is highly unusual. The big picture of Roman history is rather well known, especially from the 2nd and 1st centuries BC to the 1st centuries of our era, because these were centuries of expansion and prosperity for the Romans, not without setbacks, civil wars, and losses, but overall, the Roman Republic and then the Roman Empire expanded, got wealthier, mightier, and produced a lot of archives, monuments with inscriptions, and other archaeological remains that make this period of antiquity relatively well known. Well known, but not without blind spots, especially in provinces of the Roman Empire that were far away from the center, from Italy. The main campaigns and battles were well recorded, especially when they were victorious, as was the political life in Rome and many provinces of the empire. We also have a lot of records of social, technical, religious, and military aspects of ancient Rome. But far from the center, on the frontiers or in lesser cities, there is often not that much information. There are plenty of unknowns, but nothing as significant as the disappearance of an entire legion consisting of thousands of men. I will elaborate about what a Roman legion was in a minute. Before the Ninth Legion disappeared, there is sufficient information about it for more than 200 years, because this unit had a very long history. As a military unit, it was created probably at the beginning of the 1st century BC, around minus 90 years before the beginning of our era. Later, in 58 BC, so by the middle of the 1st century BC, it went under the command of Julius Caesar when his career was on the rise. He was governor of the province of Cisalpine Gaul at the time, which is to say, north of Italy, and he used this legion in an attack on the Helvetii, or Helvetians, a Celtic tribe that occupied part of modern Switzerland. This was a prelude to his campaign in Gaul on the other side of the Alps. From there, the Ninth Legion traveled extensively. Of course, the initial soldiers that formed the Legion decades before had left or died long before. Like a modern division, the Legion maintained its head count of fighters by regularly renewing them when they fell on battlefields or retired from the army. The Legion traveled to Greece and then to Africa, fighting for Caesar in the civil war that saw him take control of the Roman Republic in the following years. After his final victory, Caesar disbanded the Legion, which was common at the time under the Roman Republic, because maintaining standing armies in times of relative peace was too costly. Legions were invasion and defense armies, and in the Roman Republic, they did not serve as standing armies to occupy provinces in the long run. So temporarily the Ninth Legion disappeared, but not for long. A few years later, Caesar's successor, Octavian, also named Augustus, one of the most prominent figures of Roman history, and the one who in practice turned the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire, recalled the veterans of the Ninth Legion. Augustus needed them to crush rebellions against his power, first in Sicily, then in Macedonia, and finally in his war against Mark Antony and Cleopatra. The Ninth Legion fought on Augustus's side, the victorious side, in the Battle of Actium, a massive naval battle off the coast of Greece. After Augustus triumphed over his rivals, he advanced to Egypt and conquered it effectively, becoming the uncontested master of Rome. But that is another story. The Ninth Legion was sent to Hispania, to the Iberian Peninsula, to finish the conquest. Spain had fallen under Roman control decades earlier, but there was still pockets of resistance. It was not fully pacified. The main resistance came from the Cantabrians, a group of Celtic peoples that lived in the north of Spain along the Atlantic coast corresponding to the modern regions of Cantabria, Asturias, and part of Leon. The Cantabrias were subdued with the help of the Ninth Legion around 19 BC, and in Spain the legion gained the surname Hispana, after the province of Hispania. It remained often referred to as Legio Hispana in the 1st century AD, until its track was lost at the beginning of the 2nd century. After that, it kept traveling, which shows how mobile Roman armies could be. They were sent wherever necessary, sometimes thousands of miles away, to ensure the defense of borders, fight in civil wars, or participate in expansion campaigns. This time, the Ninth Legion was probably sent to campaign against Germanic tribes in the Rhine borderlands. Probably. Though records are not definitive here. What is more certain is that after this possible stop in Germany, it was sent to Pannonia, the name of an ancient Roman border province which was located south of the Danube River, in what is today parts of Hungary, Austria, Croatia, plus bits of Slovenia and Serbia. North of the Danube was an expanse in Central Europe that was dominated by Germanic tribes, which had themselves pushed away or mixed with the Celts. Rome would never be able to dominate this Germanic world, so these border provinces needed to be protected constantly against attacks and raids. But in the case of the Ninth Legion, it was relocated to the other side of Europe in 43 AD, by the middle of the 1st century, to participate in the invasion of Britain led by Emperor Claudius, the ruling emperor. While we don't know much about how the actual involvement of the Ninth Legion in the conquest itself, we know it was present because shortly after the conquest, it appeared among the provincial garrison. The conquest of Great Britain by the Romans was never completed. Parts of Wales and northern England continued resisting, even decades after they had been officially integrated within the borders of the empire. And to the north, Scotland was never truly conquered. There were expeditions, but no durable occupation. The garrisons in the province were kept busy by suppressing revolts and guarding frontiers, which remained the legion's function for the rest of the century. We will continue with the history of the Ninth Legion until its trace was lost, and you will see that the Legion's history intersects with other important events like the rebellion by Queen Boudica. But first, let's examine what the Roman legion actually was. The term legion is famous because it was the largest military unit of the Roman army. If compared with modern armies, it could be called a division or a brigade, depending on the country. The size and organization varied over the centuries, but to give you an order of magnitude, a legion had 5,000 to 6,000 men at full capacity. It was conceived as a war machine that could be autonomous. It had its own logistics, commanders at different levels, and comprised smaller and smaller units that could act independently or in coordination. Among ancient armies, this is certainly as far as any state ever went regarding organization and discipline. The Roman legion reflected the Romans' taste for efficiency through organization and standardization. We find this to a degree in all ancient civilizations. But the Romans pushed it to an extreme when it came to their legions, with spectacular results. When they fought on their frontiers against the Celts, the Germans, or different peoples of the Middle East and North Africa, battles often pitted strictly aligned ranks of Roman soldiers with their standard equipment and geometrical formations against a much less disciplined mass of warriors with different weapons and no specialization. The Romans were not always victorious, and there were cases when the chaotic organization of the barbarians could be advantageous, especially outside of large conventional battlefields, such as in forests or mountains, where harassment tactics could be employed. However, overall, the Roman war machine was rarely defeated in conventional battles or sieges for centuries because it was highly structured, organized, and did not disband easily, and obviously because Roman soldiers were well trained and often seasoned. The legions were the backbone of this successful military, but they were not all of it. The legions were the empire's elite infantry. Elite because of their training, and social elite too, because only Roman citizens could join them. These citizens paid for their equipment until the 2nd century BC, during the Republic, which limited recruitment to reasonably wealthy citizens. This barrier of having to buy equipment was eliminated in the late 2nd century BC because the Republic faced manpower shortages for its legions. After that, the state paid for equipment. But recruitment in a legion was not open to everyone. The rest of Roman armies consisted of the so-called auxiliaries, fighters who may or may not have been citizens, but generally were not. And these auxiliaries provided additional infantry and most of the cavalry in Roman armies. For most of the imperial period, the bulk of Roman armies comprised troops of auxiliaries rather than legions. Fighting as an auxiliary and being honorably discharged was a way of acquiring citizenship for people from around the Roman Empire. The status of citizenship evolved over time. At the very start of the Roman Republic, it was limited to the city of Rome. Then it was extended to Italy and later to other provinces. But this status was always limited to a minority of people living within the borders of the empire. With citizenship came a number of rights, especially political rights, but also individual protections and social status. So it was desirable to non-citizens, obviously. So serving in the army was the best way to access citizenship, and for citizens serving in a legion was also a way of social advancement. Military service in the Roman legions was demanding and dangerous, but veterans could receive land after their service. They would also gain more respect in society after their years of service, if they survived. The precise origin of the legions is unknown, at least in the form they took during the time of Julius Caesar and Augustus, when Rome became an empire and expanded faster than ever. During the Republic until the 1st century BC, legions were typically ephemeral. They were raised for specific campaigns and dissolved afterward due to maintenance costs and the risk of having an elite permanent army that could be used by ambitious generals against Republican institutions. The organization of legions underwent several reforms, so it was not set in stone. But to take an example, If we look at the structure of a legion during Julius Caesar's time in the mid-1st century BC, the basic unit was a centuria, a century of 100 men. Several of these centuries, generally 6, formed a cohort, and 10 cohorts formed a legion. Though initially comprising 100 men, hence the name, a century was later reduced to 80 men while retaining its designation. So one cohort of 6 centuries contained 480 men. 10 cohorts total 4,800 legionaries. On top of them, a small cavalry force of a few hundred men, formed by wealthier citizens who provided their own horses, was attached to each legion. This cavalry was used for pursuits, scouting, or surprise charges. It operated separately from auxiliary cavalry, which provided additional numbers while remaining attached to the legion. The legion had commanders at different levels. A well-known rank was the centurion, equivalent to a modern captain, who commanded a century. At the helm was a general. In campaigns, several legions could be coordinated by a commander, as when Julius Caesar built his fame and prestige by conquering Gaul with an army of several legions plus auxiliaries. The size of legions increased at the start of the imperial period, approaching 6,000 men. However, in the last centuries of the Roman Empire, when it faced severe challenges, the term legion was retained for smaller units of 1,500 men or less, though there were more legions in total. The golden age of the Roman legion, when they were imposing units with their thousands of soldiers, lasted from the 1st century BC to the 3rd century AD, precisely at the time of the 9th Legion. During this period, legions became permanent. They were no longer dissolved, but instead were stationed where needed and sent to participate in campaigns when necessary. There were legions that disappeared in this period and were not recreated. The worst example for the Romans was certainly the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. 3 entire legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, and their auxiliaries, were ambushed by an alliance of Germanic tribes. These Germanic warriors surprised the Romans, who were dispersed and stretched along a 10-mile-long line of march through a forest. Exactly the opposite of an environment that favored legions. They were not in formation, could not maneuver, and centurions were cut off from their chain of command. The Germans anticipated the reactions of the legionaries and their tactics because one of their leaders had received Roman military education. With all these factors against him, the 3 legions were surprised and entirely destroyed. They were not recreated, and the disaster of Teutoburg ended Roman ambitions to invade Germania as they had planned. These legions were lost, but we know why and how, because even though this disaster was a slap in the face for Rome, it marked the end of a period of very fast expansion that had begun with Augustus. This disaster was not ignored in archives. It was written about abundantly. An entire legion being wiped out was a major event for the Roman Empire, a disaster that deserved to be reported, studied, and avenged if possible. This brings us back to the Ninth Legion, because it disappeared, but we have no such record. As if no one had any interest in the loss of thousands of legionaries who were also citizens, not common men from auxiliary troops. Now let's return to the story of the Ninth Legion, where we left it. We left the legion in Britain after the conquest by Emperor Claudius in 43 AD. And I also mentioned that in the following decades, the legion remained stationed there as a garrison. Garrison duty didn't mean it was peaceful. As we saw before, there were revolts and uprisings inside the frontiers and beyond them. And in the following decades, the Ninth Legion was engaged regularly. The Roman Empire had expanded in Britain, exceeding the territories of various Celtic tribes, and it intended to do what it had already done in the north of Italy, in Spain, or in France, integrating these Celts by Romanizing them. That was accomplished not necessarily by erasing their culture, but by imposing Roman laws, social organization, administration, and the use of Latin, at least for the elite and administration. However, for many years the Celts resisted this. In 50 AD, 7 years after the invasion, there was an uprising led by the Celtic king, a chieftain called Caractacus, the chief of the Catuvellauni tribe from the southeast of England. 2 legions, including the 9th, were sent to crush it, which they did. Also in the same decade, the legion was sent to the north of England to fight another native revolt, that of the Brigantes, led by their king Venutius. The territory of the Brigantes was approximately in the region that would become Yorkshire. While these revolts were controlled, a more serious one was about to burst in the years 60 and 61, 17 years after the conquest, the rebellion of Boudica. Boudica was a queen of the Iceni tribe from the east of England in present-day Norfolk. When the Romans arrived in Britain, they exploited the feuds between tribes, allying with some of them to defeat others. They had already done the same almost a century before in Gaul. The fragmentation and rivalries between tribes had been a huge advantage for the Romans in this conquest. The king of Iceni, the husband of Boudica, had entered an alliance with the Romans. As an ally, he had been allowed to keep his land as a nominally independent small kingdom. He had left a will in which he bequeathed his kingdom jointly to his 2 daughters, his daughters with Boudica, and to the Roman emperor. He was trying to preserve some independence, at least officially, so that his family, his offspring, would not lose the throne. When he died, the Romans simply ignored his will and proceeded to annex his kingdom and take his property. This was a common way of expanding for the Romans, and it happened in different parts of their empire. They allied with neighboring kingdoms, which was the first step towards annexation, a few years or decades later. So Boudica and her daughters were spoliated of what they considered to be their rights, but instead of letting go, the queen organized an uprising of the Iceni, and she was joined by other tribes that also rejected Roman rule. Her troops marched on the city of Camalodunum in Essex, present-day Colchester, and destroyed it. Camalodunum was previously the capital of another tribe that the Romans had turned into a colonia, that is to say, a settlement in newly conquered Roman territory that served to distribute land to discharge legionaries. Legionaries were given land to establish themselves after their service, and what better option than to give them conquered land? This meets the second function of a colonia, which was to Romanize a new province. The laws, language, and urbanism of a colonia was purely Roman. So a new colonia served as a beacon of Roman influence in a new province. Destroying Camalodunum was a clear sign of rejection of Roman order. Camalodunum was a resounding victory for Boudica and the Britons she led. Significant Roman forces sent to stop her had been defeated, including the Ninth Legion, which had never suffered such a defeat in its already long history. Most of its foot soldiers were killed in battle as they tried to relieve the besieged city. The legion was almost wiped out. Only its cavalry escaped. However, it did not disappear. It was reinforced with new legionaries, coming especially from the provinces of Germania that were sent to Britannia in the following years. In the year 61, the situation looked very serious for the Romans because after the destruction of Camalodunum and a large part of their forces in Britain, Boudica was now marching on Londinium, the capital of Roman Britain. Londinium was a Roman settlement established during or shortly after the invasion on the current site of the city of London. The settlement was still small, being less than 20 years old back then in 61, and it appeared that it would not be defensible because Roman forces had been routed at Camalodunum. The detachment of what remained of the Ninth Legion tried to stop Boudica's forces, but was beaten again. And Londinium was captured and burnt to the ground, another heavy symbol of rejection of the Romans. At this point, the situation was critical, and it seems the Emperor Nero at the time, who had succeeded Claudius, considered the complete withdrawal from Britain. It was a source of problems, and being at the margin of the empire without resources that the Romans really needed, it had turned into a costly headache that did not feel necessary, except that a withdrawal would have been humiliating, and the Romans did not typically evacuate territories they had conquered. A last chance attempt was tried. The governor Suetonius regrouped his forces, including the remnants of the Ninth Legion, and confronted the Britons. The Romans were outnumbered because, as Boudica advanced, she had gained followers from different tribes that joined her rebellion. We don't know exactly how many were in her army, but possibly more than 200,000. A huge force, even though it was not very organized nor well equipped, probably. This was multiple times the number of Roman soldiers that remained in Britain at this point. But the Romans were motivated because the Britons took no prisoners. They executed everyone they captured, including Roman civilians. So it was victory or death for them. They managed to obtain a confrontation on favorable terrain. in a pass between hills with woods behind that strongly reduced the Britons' numerical advantage. Their discipline and superior equipment did the rest. They advanced in wedge formation, deployed their cavalry, and, against all odds, the Romans won. Boudica's army disbanded. Many of her men were lost, and the Romans pushed their advantage to recover control of everything they had lost. Roman Britain was saved, at least for now. Boudica died shortly after. We don't know if it was either by suicide or due to illness. But with her died this attempt to expel the Romans from Britain. It was one of the most threatening rebellions the Romans had faced across their empire. The figure of Boudica remains widely famous in the UK because 15 centuries later, during the Renaissance, her rebellion against the Romans became a highlight of British ancient history. This culminated in the 19th century during the Victorian period, when she became a cultural figure and a kind of national heroine. The same process appeared in different European countries in modern times, as they were affirming their specificity as nations and establishing a national history. They needed figures that appeared pre-Roman and pre-Christian ideally, to establish roots that started far back and could symbolize national independence. In Great Britain, Boudica became one of them. In France, an equivalent is Vercingetorix, a Celtic chieftain who had led a coalition of Celtic tribes against the Roman invasion of Julius Caesar. Like Boudica, he had initial successes repelling the Romans before losing it all. Both had tragic destinies and ultimately lost, but they put up a fight. They were adopted as cultural figures and national heroes, even though in both cases we know very little about their actual character. Now returning to the Ninth Legion, we saw that it had been almost destroyed during Boudica's rebellion and saved in extremis by the successful Roman pushback. We know it was reinforced and sent again to the north of England, where in the year 70, 10 years after Boudica, they fought another campaign against the Brigantes in Yorkshire. Stamps on tiles found in York tell us that the Ninth Legion built a fort in the city in those years. By the years 70 and 80, Roman control over England had finally strengthened. It was still not fully peaceful like other West European provinces, but the risk of large-scale rebellion seemed now to be behind them. Romanization was advancing, and to the Britons, like other peoples before them, it was appealing. It brought certain prosperity, exotic products arriving from the continent, better agricultural yield, so fewer food problems. It had ended the cycle of wars between rival tribes, and native elites had increasingly embraced Roman rule. But to the north, Scotland was still independent. In the years 82, 83, so now 40 years after the invasion and 20 years after Boudica's rebellion, a general and politician named Agricola led an invasion of Scotland. The Romans called Scotland Caledonia. Actually, not necessarily all of Scotland. For them, Caledonia was the northern half of Scotland, north of the River Forth. Sometimes they used the term Caledonia for everything north of Roman Britain, and later the term came to name all of Scotland as a romantic or poetic name. The Romans managed to invade Caledonia, but never to control it. It remained outside the administration of Roman Britain and could not be pacified. The Ninth Legion participated in the 82-83 invasion, and according to Tacitus, who was a Roman historian, it narrowly avoided destruction again in Scotland in an ambush by the Caledonians. Their camp was attacked at night, and the Scots surprised the legion in its sleep. Hand-to-hand fighting ensued, and the legion was saved by relief cavalry sent by Agricola. The Caledonians were pushed back. The detail of the legion's operations in Scotland is not very well known, but 25 years later, the legion was still in the north of England. There is evidence that it was stationed in York in the year 108. This was written on a stone tablet found in York, and after 108, nothing. At least nothing in Britain. No other known record across the entire Roman Empire indicates that the legion would have moved to another part of Britain. But inscriptions found in the Netherlands on the site of a fortress that corresponds to modern Nijmegen again suggests that the Ninth Legion could have been relocated there. However, this is not fully conclusive for two reasons. First, because it could have been just a detachment of the Ninth Legion. A British detachment is attested at Nijmegen in this period, the first decades of the 2nd century, but we don't know whether the entire legion was sent there or if it was a mix of various units based in Britannia to reinforce defenses against Germanic tribes. A second reason is the nature of these remains found in the Netherlands. There are tile stamps, part of a military medal, and an altar to god Apollo that belonged most probably to members of the legion. There are inscriptions on them that indicate this, but it doesn't mean the legion as a whole was there. It could have been just survivors relocated to other units and sent to the Netherlands. These finds in the Netherlands have been dated to around the year 120. After that, there is no other record of the legion anywhere. We know it ceased to exist at some point because there is an exhaustive list of existing Roman legions dating from the year 197, 77 years later. In this list, 33 legions are listed, and there is no trace of the 9th. So it appears that the legion disappeared at some point between 108 in Yorkshire or 120 in the Netherlands and 197. But no records of battle indicates that it was destroyed. And this is puzzling because the 2nd century is not a dark age or a time of big disruption for the Roman Empire. It's just the opposite. This period is generally considered to be a peak for Rome, a time when, for decades, civil wars were avoided. The empire expanded and got stronger and more prosperous, built a lot, and produced an abundance of inscriptions, chronicles, and archaeological remains. So what happened to the Ninth Legion? How could a military unit with thousands of men, thousands of citizens, including from wealthy and influential families, disappear apparently unnoticed, or at least unreported. A traditional theory suggests it was peculiar how the legion disappeared in this manner, hypothesizing that it had probably been destroyed in northern England, where it was stationed at the beginning of the 2nd century. This theory dominated before the discovery of inscriptions, suggesting that all or part of the legion could have been in the Netherlands around 120. However, as mentioned, the discovery in the Netherlands serves as a clue rather than a definitive proof. It likely confirms that some members of the 9th Legion were in the Netherlands around the year 120, but it doesn't prove the entire unit was present there. For this reason, the traditional theory remains plausible, at least to explain how part of the legion disappeared. The last trace of the 9th Legion in Britain is dated 108 AD. We know that around this time, the northern frontier of Roman Britain, the border with Caledonia, Scotland, was far from peaceful. The Caledonians were hostile on the other side, and Yorkshire, the land of the Brigantes, may still have been rebellious. The Brigantes might have revolted again after 108 AD and destroyed the legion. Supporting this hypothesis, various Roman sources from the 2nd century agree that keeping the Britons under control was nearly impossible at the start of the 2nd century. Around 122 AD, Emperor Hadrian visited Britain and initiated the construction of Hadrian's Wall to protect the northern frontier of Roman Britain from the Caledonians. While there is no contemporary record of a military disaster in Yorkshire during these years, which is unusual if such an event occurred, such a disaster could plausibly explain the decision to build Hadrian's Wall. Although Romans typically preferred to document their victories, their writings did not shy away from recording defeats and setbacks. Therefore, the notion that the legion was completely destroyed without anyone documenting it would be quite unusual. Legions in the 2nd century were never disbanded. When they were no longer needed somewhere, they were relocated elsewhere, not eliminated like during the time of the Republic. The hypotheses of relocation, plus the discoveries in the Netherlands about the presence of the legion, or part of it, made this first explanation fall out of favor with some historians. However, others continue to think that destruction in Britain is the most likely scenario, and that it could have happened around 110 or 120 AD, before Hadrian's visit and the construction of the wall. The supporters of this theory also argue that involvement elsewhere is not backed by any evidence. The inscriptions and personal belongings found in the Netherlands only indicate that perhaps part of the legion was there. But as mentioned before, what if they were just a few veteran survivors relocated there after the destruction of the legion? It is not conclusive evidence that the whole legion was sent to the continent. Scholars inclined to believe in the theory of destruction in Britain acknowledge that it is very unusual not to have records of this disaster, but it doesn't mean it is impossible. There could have been a series of coincidences that made them disappear, or records exist and have not been found yet. But still, The hypotheses that the legion had not been destroyed in Britain led to other theories. It is established that it no longer existed by 197 AD. So something had to happen between at least 120 and 197 AD. If the legion had been relocated in the meantime, it could have disappeared in another conflict. Perhaps even the withdrawal of the Ninth Legion from Yorkshire led to the troubles in northern England before Hadrian's visit. Two conflicts of the 2nd century, where the legion could have disappeared, deserve our attention because each of them provides a hypothesis that has some merit. The first major event was a Jewish revolt that broke out in Judea in the year 132 AD. Although Judea was at the opposite corner of the Roman Empire, it is plausible that a legion would be redeployed so far from its previous assignment. You remember that the Ninth Legion had traveled extensively in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD through Italy, Greece, Africa, Spain, and Britain. So why not Judea? Because during the 1st and 2nd centuries, this province was particularly troublesome. The Romans had established a large military presence in Judea during the 1st century, but the Jews resisted Romanization and occupation, which led to several revolts that were violently suppressed. The revolt of 132 AD was the third major uprising since Roman occupation. It was led by Simon Bar Kokhba, a Jewish military leader who had been initially quite successful. He managed to establish an independent state in Judea for 3 years, effectively eliminating Roman rule in the land he controlled, which encompasses much of the province. This meant that the Romans had to reconquer their province. Emperor Hadrian assembled a large army from across the empire. This fact makes the theory that the Ninth Legion was sent there plausible, even though it is not supported by any known documents. It took 6 legions plus auxiliaries and elements from several other legions to finally crush the revolt and conquer Judea. This prolonged rebellion or war had disastrous consequences for both sides. The Romans suffered heavy casualties, and it is possible that a legion engaged in this conflict could have disappeared. However, the consequences were far worse for the Jews. Between the reconquest and subsequent retaliation, Judea was significantly depopulated, as many Jews were killed or expelled, to the point that some historians consider this revolt, which lasted from 132 to 136 AD, as a moment when Jews became a minority in the land of Israel, though others date this demographic shift to a later period of the Roman or Byzantine Empire. But in any case, there is no doubt that the Bar Kokhba uprising ended terribly for the Jews and left deep scars, starting with increased persecutions against them across the Roman Empire. Bar Kokhba doesn't have a favorable reputation in Jewish historiography. He seemed to have been quite exhilarated and presented himself as a Messiah sent to guide his people. However, he ultimately led the Jews to disaster and was regarded a false Messiah. So, did the Ninth Legion disappear in Judea? Maybe, but this remains speculative, as there is no known exhaustive listing of troops sent to Judea that could answer this question. While it is possible that given the quantity of troops sent to Judea, one unit might not be mentioned anywhere, but this is not conclusive proof. It could also be argued that an unrecorded disaster in Britain seems mysterious and unlikely. But the deployment and destruction of a legion on the other side of the empire, leaving no trace, is even more improbable. Another reason for supporting the Judean theory is that another legion, the 22nd, also disappeared from records in the same period. The 22nd Legion was based in Egypt and was engaged in Judea. It is documented in the province during this period, and after the conflict it disappears from records. It is believed that the 22nd Legion was destroyed in Judea. If this happened to it, why not to the 9th as well? But again, this is pure speculation. A second alternative theory to the destruction in Britain suggests that the 9th Legion disappeared in Cappadocia. Not in the 130s, but later in the 160s. And why is that? East of the Roman provinces of the Middle East, Judea, Syria, and Anatolia, modern Turkey, was Rome's most formidable enemy, the Parthian Empire. The two states were either at war or in periods of armed peace for a long time, with neither able to completely dominate the region. There was an open war from 161 to 166 between Emperor Marcus Aurelius in Rome and King Vologases IV in the Parthian Empire. During this war, an unspecified legion was surrounded and destroyed in Cappadocia, in modern Turkey. This presents something peculiar because there were two legions permanently stationed in Cappadocia, the 12th and the 15th legions. These two legions kept appearing in records well after this battle, including in the 3rd century, so none of them was destroyed. It must have been another one sent as reinforcement or in transit in Cappadocia, but we don't know which one. Why not the 9th Legion? But here again, there is no proof of this, and it could perfectly be another one. Some historians think it could even be the 22nd, this legion stationed in Egypt, which disappeared from records after the time of the rebellion in Judea. I mentioned earlier it was assumed to have been destroyed in Judea. But what if it wasn't, and was eliminated instead 30 years later in Cappadocia? This remains a question mark and a possible explanation for the disappearance of the 9th Legion. But as there is zero evidence, it is also just speculation, and in a sense it sounds even less likely than a disappearance in Judea, because we would have to assume that the 9th Legion continued to exist for more than 50 years after its last traces in England, that it traveled, was engaged in battles, and finally disappeared in modern Turkey without leaving a single known trace anywhere for half a century. And this is where we are today. It is not that the mystery of the 9th Legion is unexplainable. There are different plausible possibilities. But we don't know with certainty which one is correct. Perhaps the most likely explanation remains that the 9th Legion met its destruction in the north of England in a poorly documented uprising of peoples from the region. The Brigantes in Yorkshire and/or other tribes from Scotland who crossed the border at a time when Hadrian's Wall did not yet exist. We would have to accept the accounts of its destruction were lost, and that for some reason the news did not travel through the Roman Empire and was not much written about or commented. Strange and very unusual, but technically not impossible. From there, a few survivors may have been relocated to other units, explaining the belongings found in the Netherlands, or if the Legion did not disappear in Britain, it could have been sent elsewhere and vanished. But this remains less likely because, as mentioned earlier, while the 2nd century had its challenges for the Roman Empire, but it was a rather stable and prosperous period for a majority of provinces. Really not a time of chaos during which track of large military units could be easily lost. The story of the 9th Legion remains probably more known in the UK than elsewhere because it was stationed there for decades and was a significant part of the history of Roman Britain. Being engaged in the initial conquest and the revolt of Boudica and other rebellions, as well as expeditions to Scotland. Maybe future archaeological finds in Britain or elsewhere will bring an answer to this disappearance. For now, the mystery lives on. We have reached the end of our journey tonight, and I hope you liked it and that you could learn a few things about ancient Rome along the way. I will be back with another story soon. And until we meet again, good night. Sleep well.